When I was 9 years old in the city of Ambala, my family had gone there for a wedding. And in the morning, all the children would get around the well to bathe. So the first morning I rushed out, took off all my clothes except for my underwear, ready to have a cold well bath. My aunt and mother rushed towards me and covered me up with a towel and took me away. I think that was my first realization that I was different from the boys. When I was 13, I had my first period. I was horrified, I was filled with shame, and it was my older sister who told me that I would have these every month for the rest of my life. My mother never said a word to me. When I was 13, 14, 15, I was touched inappropriately just about everywhere, on the streets, going to school, later in college. So by the time I was 18 and got my first sari, I decided I didn't really want to be a woman. Everyone has a gender story. We just don't know about it. And these gender stories are really powerful. They set us up, they limit us, they may expand us if we're lucky, but mostly they limit us. They limit us in terms of our behaviors, in terms of what's appropriate, what's morally right, what's wrong, and they shape our world in ways we don't even know. What we have not recognized about gender stories is the trauma inherent in them. The primary story that still rules the world is patriarchy. What is patriarchy? Patriarchy basically says that men are powerful and women exist to support them. Now, in this world today, it seems like that's an exaggeration, but it isn't. So I'm going to give you a few examples of how there have been lots of changes in the external world, in education and employment, but not in the internal world. This last decade, I've spent primarily trying to understand educated, well-off women in India and understanding how they see themselves, their definitions of what it means to be a good woman or a woman. I've published this in a book called Chup and talk about 7 habits. Let me just talk about 2 habits right now. One is that women are required to smile, to please others. So pleasing is a big habit, but not to laugh loudly. Why is that? It's because if you laugh loudly, you claim that you're alive and you are entitled to joy. And if you're entitled to joy, then you have an independent existence. Pleasing is another behavior that's very problematic because pleasing is actually very pleasing. People like to be pleased. But when women please continuously, they completely lose touch with their own desires, with their own pleasure, with their own needs, with their own wants. They also forget their own opinions. And this is very deep training because when you're trained to please others, it's much easier to live with someone who's dominant. And so it's really a preparation for patriarchy, to make the dominance of men continue to exist so that women fill that role. The second thing that I did was, after talking to women, I also turned to men, because men and women are interlinked. And I spent 2 years talking to educated men, asking them the same question on what does it mean to be a man today. I interviewed and spoke to 7- and 9-year-old boys, as well as up to about 45-year-old men. And the 3 things that came up in their definitions of power is to be strong, to be powerful, and to be aggressive. There's nothing wrong with being strong and powerful, but the definitions of women excluded these qualities. And so for men the essence of men existing was not to be like a woman. So 9-year-old boys said that if they were not strong, they were bullied and they were laughed at. And this 9-year-old boy said when he went to the gym and he couldn't lift the heavy weights, he felt weak and fell into shame. Shame is a horrible emotion to live in with your life, because shame basically says that there's something wrong with me. When I feel that there's something wrong with me, I naturally go into hiding and I start pretending. So men have to pretend to be strong, and that is traumatic, and they can't ask for help. One of the most damaging impacts of always having to be powerful is that you're not allowed to be vulnerable. You can't cry, you can't not know, and you always have to be in charge. Not being allowed to have emotions is very, very dehumanizing. In fact, one of the emotions felt men felt they could express is anger. But anger, not regulated, is very, very harmful. I think the last thing I'd say that in terms of emotional well-being or underlying trauma is anxiety, fear, and hatred. And if there is hatred, that leads to violence in the world, as we're seeing throughout. I think it's important to remember that most of the violence, whether it's in the families or at the global level, emerges from men's definitions of masculinity. It's important to distinguish between men and masculinity and women and the notion of womanhood, and across the gender spectrum, whatever identity is being claimed. We often think that gender inequality is an issue of poorer countries, like India, countries in Africa, Latin America, and that's just not true. So I want to take a minute to talk about the US. In the US, it's not just that many of the laws are going backwards, but the behavioral research shows that younger men are feeling more pressure to act in hyper-masculine ways. So compared to earlier times, 87% of boys and men feel the pressure not to be emotionally expressive. About 57% of the men feel the pressure to talk about women in sexual ways. And over 60% feel the pressure to punch out others when they're angry. So it's not the case that with greater education, with greater income, there will naturally be more gender equality. I think the primary reason for lack of gender equality is because we haven't focused on changing the story. We have to change the story of men being more powerful and women being less powerful, and everyone else on the gender spectrum, whether they're non-binary, non-conforming, queer, or whatever space they claim, just don't exist. What is the different story, gender story? I think the gender stories so far focus only on power. The gender stories that we need to claim need to focus both on claiming power as well as love for men, women, and every human being self-identified on the gender spectrum. What do I mean by that? In a study in India, we asked men for the 3 words that come to mind when they think of themselves as men. Not a single man used the word love. When we talk to women, almost no woman used the word power. So this bifurcation of love as women's responsibility and power as men's responsibility is creating chaos in the world. all human beings need power, to know that, yes, I can make a difference, whatever that means to you, as well as love, which is the deep human connection, which is the deep human longing to belong. Whether you're in a city or a rural area, whether you're poor, whether you're brown, you're black, you're disabled, and all the intersections of powerlessness that go with it. So if we all need power and love, how we interact with each other would be different. How we change will be different. And it's not about shaming other people. It's about bringing more compassion and more understanding to this process of change, because this gender story is foundational in how we recreate, how we build community around ourselves for a peaceful future.